Okay, so I think we will go ahead and get started. I have started the recording, so we'll go ahead and jump in. Welcome everyone. It's great to have you all here today. We're going to be talking about information has value. So just make sure. There we go. For those who don't know me, my name is Jane Hammonds, and I am an assistant professor in the university libraries. I am the teaching and learning engagement librarian. And so a big part of my job is focused on working with instructors to think through options for how to integrate information literacy into the curriculum. My email is hammonds.73. If you do have any questions or comments after the workshop, please feel free to go ahead and email me. I am always happy to talk about information literacy, so I'd love to hear from you. All right, so we'll go ahead and jump in. I'd like to start with a quick little activity for everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll that has just some really quick true-false questions for everyone. So I'll go ahead and open that poll. You all should now be seeing that, and I'll give you 30 seconds or so to go ahead and start entering your responses. Let's see. And it looks like maybe there might be a problem. Oh. So we'll take a check here and make sure, can everyone hear me? Okay, yeah, looks like most people can, great. So give everyone a few more questions, a few more seconds to submit their answers to the polls. All right, so we'll go ahead and end the polling in 3, 2, 1, and polling. And I'm going to go ahead and share the results with everyone. So hopefully you all should now be able to see the poll results. So basically, as you saw, we had just some quick little true-false questions to have people start thinking about the idea of information has value. So first question was, all scholarly journal articles are available through Google for free. So most of you said that that was false. Purchasing a single scholarly journal article can require a payment of $50 or more. Most of you said that was true. When you write a story or take a picture, you automatically own the copyright for your creation or image. So that one had a little bit more of a mixed response. The majority said that was false. Information sources that do not have a clear author listed do not have to be cited. Everyone agreed that one is false. And then in academic culture, certain sources are considered more valuable than others. Again, everyone agreed that one is true. So I agree with all of you on the question number 4 and number 5 that everyone else agreed with. I really will quickly go through my thoughts on the other questions here. So when you write a story or take a picture, you automatically own the copyright for your creation image. A lot of you said that was false. That is actually true. You do not actually have to apply for the copyright of something that you create on your own. You have the copyright. Purchasing a single scholarly journal article can require payment of $50 or more. Most of you said that is true, and that is true. And then all scholarly journal articles are available through Google for free, and most of you said that one is false, and that one is false. So I'm going to stop sharing the results here. And so the reason why I started with this poll was because I think it's a good example of a really quick activity that you can do to get students starting to think about the value of information. And that's really our focus for today, is looking at this issue of information has value, and thinking about this concept as it is presented in the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education. So we're going to provide a quick overview of that concept. We're going to look at some specific student learning bottlenecks that might be related to information has value. And we're going to think about some strategies, activities, or assignments that you could use to teach the information has value concept. And I did want to clarify here that this is not necessarily all about assignments that are about teaching students about citation and plagiarism. There are a few example assignments that I have that are focused on creating citations or plagiarism issues. But most of the activities and assignments are really intended to have students think more broadly about the value of information and this concept of information has value. So an activity like the one we just did, where we have students start to think about the costs of specific types of resources, or their own particular rights as an information creator, those kinds of assignments, getting them to think more broadly about the idea of information having value. I wanted to take a second here to allow everyone a chance to download a document that they can use to start creating an action plan for integrating information literacy into the curriculum. And Stephanie, if you could add that link to the chat box there. This is not required at all, but since this is billed as a workshop, I do want to have everyone have the chance to leave with something in hand that's sort of the beginning of a plan for how they can integrate information, or integrate information has value into one of their courses. So I will allow everyone that is interested the chance to go ahead and download that document. I don't expect at all that you will complete the entire document, but it will be a place where you can start adding some notes, start thinking through this concept and how you might approach teaching this in your class. And then if you do, after the workshop, decide that you want to go ahead and complete that plan and you would like feedback, you would like to talk more about it, then you always are free to email me and we can talk more about it then. So I'll just pause for a second just to let everyone have a chance to download that. If you have any problems with that, go ahead and post that in the chat, so we'll make sure that everyone's able to do it without too much difficulty. Okay, so I will go ahead and move forward. That link there is in the chat box. So if you do want to decide as we're going through that you want to download that, that is available to you. Okay. So what are we talking about when we talk about information has value? I know that some of you out there have been to some of the other workshops in this series, so you're already a little bit more familiar with the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education. Hope you won't mind if just briefly, since I know there might be some new people in as well, that I'll give just a quick overview of the Framework for Information Literacy. So basically the framework was created by the Association of College and Research Libraries, and it was published in 2015. And it provides an updated and expanded definition of information literacy. So previous definitions of information literacy had been very skill-based and were focused on finding, evaluating, and using information. And obviously that is very important, but the framework wanted to sort of look beyond those skills and focuses more on concepts. The framework highlights this idea that there are core underlying concepts about information, about scholarship, about research that experts understand, but novices or students don't. And it's in this sort of this gap between understanding about these concepts that a lot of the misconceptions or frustrations that are experienced between students and instructors when it comes to research or any kind of inquiry or information use assignments arise, right? That there are things that experts understand about scholarship, about research, that novices do not. And so it really highlights what these core concepts are. And without an understanding of these core concepts, a lot of the things that we ask students to do related to research and scholarship may not make a lot of sense. You know, they may be able to do things, but still not understand why, you know, why do we insist that students often use scholarly journal articles? You know, it's because that academics value those articles because they understand the process that goes into art, how those are created. They understand the peer review process. And that's why those are often considered more valuable than other types of information sources. But students, they just might see that as a requirement, as I have to have this type of source without really understanding why. So there's my quick overview of the framework for information literacy. Of those 6 core concepts, one of those core concepts is this idea that information has value. So to jump into a little bit more specifically about what we mean when we talk about this concept, we're going to watch a quick video. I hope that everyone will be able to hear it. Here we go.
For a creative writing class, Zoe submits a story based on the Harry Potter series. She acknowledges that she is using characters created by another, but she puts her own unique spin on the story. Later, Zoe wants to publish her story in the campus literary journal, but the student editor is hesitant. She likes the story, but she is worried. Is Zoe committing copyright infringement? Or is her story covered by fair use? In this situation, concerns that Zoe and her editor are considering are based on the fact that information has value. The editor recognizes that because of the financial and social value, there are both legal and ethical guidelines for how information sources and creative works can be used and shared. Zoe, who has been raised at a time when technology makes it easy to share and remix information and works created by others, struggles to understand why what she is doing might be problematic. When deciding whether or not the story should be published, both Zoe and her editor must carefully consider complicated issues related to copyright, fair use, and parody, and determine the potential consequences. In recognizing that information has value, they also must recognize that this means that they have certain rights and responsibilities when it comes to accessing, sharing, and using information.
So to think more about this concept, information has value holds this idea that information has multiple different types of value, and that could be financial value, but it could be educational value, it could be social, political, personal value. Even if information is not actually worth anything in terms of, you know, a financial worth, it could still have a lot of value to an individual. For example, you know, scholars don't get paid for their articles, but those articles have a lot of value to them, their reputation as scholars. And so that's a really important personal value. Right? Because of this value, there are a number of different factors that influence the creation, the access, the distribution of information. And there are legal and ethical guidelines surrounding the access and use of information. So experts, scholars, researchers understand that they have responsibilities both as information consumers and information creators. And they also have rights as information consumers and information creators. And they understand how important it is to make really deliberate and informed choices about how they access information, how they share information, their own personal information, their own personal creations. Right? So novice learners can really struggle with this, right? Especially if we think of our students, most of them have been raised in an entirely digital environment where it seems that they have very quick, easy access to so much information, right? And all of that information seems like it's free, right? You go to Google, you go to Wikipedia, and you have so much information available to you, right? And so you have such easy access to information. And almost all of the information that you're accessing is in sort of intangible or digital format. And so that can really make it easy to mask how much labor is involved in creating that information, and it can help to mask the value of that information. Right? You know, if you walked into someone's house and you took a book off their shelf and walked out with it, you know that you're doing something wrong. You're taking an object that has value to them, you know, something that they paid for. But, you know, when it's something that you access online, it can be easy to not really see that things actually might belong to other people. You know, it might be someone else's intellectual property. And so it can be a lot easier to have this idea that if I can access it, then I should be able to use it. It should be free to me. And you think about the fact that journal articles, for example, how many of our students have ever actually held a print academic journal in their hands before? Not many. You know, what's the last time that you held a print academic journal in your hands? So when they encounter these articles that are sort of posted all over the place, and it seems so easy to access them, you know, the value of that source, it can be hidden. You know, it's not really as clear as it was in a time when everything was in physical form. Another thing that sometimes can be really challenging for students to understand is this idea that not everyone has equal access to the information or equal ability to make their voice heard. A lot of our learners have had very easy access to information and information technology, and may not really recognize the barriers to information that others may experience. And this is something that I've asked students in my classes before, you know, if they have access to technology, who doesn't? And a lot of students will comment, oh, everyone in the United States has access to information. And then one of their classmates will pipe up and say, no, you know, I have to go to my in-laws' house to use the internet, or I have to go, you know, to a coffee shop to be able to use the internet. And so it's sometimes really surprising to students that even their classmates don't have a lot of easy access to information. Another concept, so as I mentioned, intellectual property, this is one that can be a real challenge for students to understand, that such a thing as intellectual property exists. This idea that there are various cultural differences to what intellectual property is, you know, how intellectual property is conceived of, what's considered intellectual property. And a lot of times the first ways that students encounter this issue is these very harsh warnings that they get about plagiarism. Never plagiarize and always cite your sources. You're stealing if you don't. You're going to get in so much trouble if you plagiarize. And so they hear these warnings a lot of times, and that's sort of the first way that they encounter this, and not really understanding the background of what intellectual property is. So the framework itself outlines specific actions, what they call knowledge practices, and ways of thinking that they call dispositions that are important for students to start to demonstrate as they're developing their understanding of information has value. So I'm just going to highlight a few of these. These are not all of the dispositions or knowledge practices, but I just wanted to pick a few to highlight. So it's really important that students learn to start learning how to respect the original ideas of others, value the skills, time, and effort that are needed to produce knowledge. And I think that this is something that's often really missing from students is they see a finished product and have no idea really how long it takes to create that product. I've often asked students in class, you know, from the time a scholar has an idea for an article, how long do you think it takes before they see that article in print? And they're always really surprised when I say it's, you know, it's 2 years, it's 3 years, because it takes that long to go through that whole process. So kind of starting to see the background behind that information and how it's created can help to really develop this understanding of the value of that information source. And also, again, examining their own information privilege. So recognizing that in many cases, and especially as college students, they have more access to information than they ever will at any other time in their life. Knowledge practices. So again, giving credit to the ideas of others, learning to distinguish the characteristics of things like copyright, fair use, open access, knowing what public domain resources are. And then really learning about taking the time to make choices about their own online actions. So thinking of themselves as information creators, as information sharers, And so when they are sharing information online, when they're sharing personal information online, making really informed choices and thinking critically about what it means to share so much of themselves online, or if they act as those that are passing on information to others, making responsible choices in what information they choose to pass on to others. So an understanding of this concept will really help students to be better prepared to make those informed and ethical decisions about how information is accessed, how it's used, how it's shared, and that includes information that they create themselves and information that's created by others. And they'll start to better understand the need for those complex rules around citations and plagiarism and copyright. If you really start to understand the value of information, those harsh warnings that you get all the time about citations and plagiarism, you start to understand why those might be necessary. So quick summary of this concept. Information has value holds that information has multiple types of value, which could be financial, but could be other types of value as well. And that value could be for both the consumer and the creator of the information. As a result of that, there are often very complex guidelines and laws around the access, use, and sharing of information. And so students may really struggle to recognize that all of that information that seems so free and easy to access may have value. And they may struggle to really make sense of their own rights and responsibilities as information consumers and information creators. All right, so I'm going to pause right there and take a minute to see if there are any questions or comments related to this concept of information has value. And if you do have any questions or comments, you can just add those directly into the chat. We'll give it another 30 seconds. I know it sometimes can take people a little bit of time to get their thoughts together. Okay, I think we'll go ahead then to our next section. And this, I just wanted again to have everyone pause and think about their experiences with students as instructors, or their own experience as students, and think about what challenges or frustrations might students be having that are related to this idea that they're not really grasping the value of information. And then you can look at it on the other side. When students really get this concept, what will really start to make sense to them that didn't make sense to them before?
Jane, I think we have a question.
So yeah, so question from Brian. How much is it students struggling to understand these concepts versus students not wanting to put in the effort to use citations? That's a great question, Brian. And I think definitely some of it can be traced to just not wanting to put that effort in there. But I do think that once you start understanding the value of citations, it makes it a little bit more easy to understand why that effort is worth it. Hopefully a couple of the activities we talk about later on today will get to that point. But yeah, I agree that there definitely is just some issues there with, it's can be annoying to deal with citations, and so sometimes they just don't want to. Tracy commented, how can we prepare freshman students with this type of resource? Is it a class that they can learn to take to learn this? So Tracy, I'm not aware of any specific classes just on sort of this concept of information has value. We do have through the library's does offer courses, one that's called Information Search and Evaluation and Use. It's Arts and Sciences 2120, and one that's Academic Online Research, which is Arts and Sciences 2121. So we do offer through the libraries 2 credit hour 7-week courses that touch on this topic, although not only on this topic. But it also is a great idea to think about, like I said, we're going to talk about some assignments or activities that instructors might be able to use. But I love the idea of thinking of a course that is also on this topic. Carrie mentioned, what about the out loud modules? That's a great reminder, Carrie. So the libraries also does offer a module called Out Loud, the library assignment that can be assigned to students. It's traditionally assigned to students in their survey courses that goes through some of the thinking processes related to using information, although it's specifically not focused on information value, but that also could be an option for students. So Nick added, already touched on, but mostly on the value of peer-reviewed journals as opposed to Wikipedia and blog news, news blogs. Absolutely. Students, I think, sometimes really struggle with why is there such an emphasis on using these scholarly sources when other sources are so much quicker and easier to access and quicker and easier to read. Yeah, so hopefully as they start to understand the time and the effort that it takes to create those sources and the process by which those sources are vetted, can start to help see why those are considered more valuable. Karen added, I encourage my students to create their works cited reference pages first, as that is perhaps one of the most time-consuming tasks. Once it's done, they know that in-text citations may come easier. That's a good idea, Karen. And I know that I personally, as a information creator, get very frustrated at the end when I'm like, oh, now I have to go through and make sure all my citations are correct. So thinking about citations first may be a great way to kind of get them over that issue. Great. All right, so I'm just gonna take 1 second to check the time here and we'll go ahead and move on to our next section. So I just want to briefly talk about some student learning bottlenecks that may be related to this, and these build on the, what you all have already identified through our chat here. If you're not familiar with the term student learning bottlenecks, this is basically just those places where a significant number of students might get stuck. Where you see over and over again semester after semester, students are struggling with the same thing. So I just want to highlight a few student learning bottlenecks that I see related to this concept. And I see these in multiple different areas. Again, not necessarily just related to citations and plagiarism, but also areas related to information access, online privacy and safety, their own rights as information consumers or information creators as well. So information access, this idea of free versus proprietary information. We've already talked about this, but because information sources appear to be free, students don't really recognize the cost. And one of those, of course, is the fact that there's a cost of accessing the internet, which I think a lot of students don't really think about as a cost involved in information. And so because of this lack of understanding this idea of free versus proprietary information, not really recognizing why there are all these restrictions on how information can be used. One of the things we see a lot is this frustration when students do encounter this idea that not everything that they are trying to look for is free. When students encounter a paywall, often they immediately, that's it. I'm not going to attempt to even get that source. They're just going to use whatever is available to them for free, even though the stuff that's free may be of lesser quality. And so a lot of students don't really recognize that when they do encounter those paywalls, there are so many options for getting those resources through the library. And even if they do know that, sometimes they're just not willing to wait. I've had multiple conversations with students where, they'll be like, I need access to this article. Okay, it's going to take, 24 hours or 48 hours so we can get this source for you through interlibrary loan. And they'll be like, nope, that's okay. Don't need it. Either because they waited so late that their paper's due the next day, or they just don't have the patience to wait to get that source. So we see a lot of students just using the information that's available to them freely, rather than waiting for that information that they might have to take a little bit more time to access. So plagiarism and citations, again, we've already talked about this, but especially because so much of the information that you find online often doesn't have a really clear author. When we talk about websites or we talk about sources like Wikipedia, sometimes students don't even recognize that citations are needed. Because plagiarism is often taught in terms of stealing, if there's not someone that you're stealing from, it can seem like, well, there's nothing, there's no problem. There's not a clear author. If I take someone else's work, then yeah, I'm doing something wrong. There's clearly someone that's being hurt by this. But why can't I just copy from Wikipedia? There's no one author that I'm stealing from there. So I think students don't even a lot of times really recognize that citations are required in that case. Another issue with plagiarism and citations, I've already mentioned this, but because everything is in a digital format now, without that sort of tangible physical object that students are touching, it can again make it more difficult to really recognize the need to provide citations. Copyright infringement and plagiarism. This is one that a lot of students struggle with, this idea that there is a difference between plagiarism and copyright infringement, with plagiarism being an ethical violation and copyright infringement being a legal violation. So we know that, our students are out there, maybe downloading movies that they shouldn't be downloading or music that they shouldn't be downloading. And again, that seems in a different category to them than plagiarism. And, maybe it doesn't seem as bad as it might be. So yeah, those kinds of distinctions between those topics can be really challenging for students to get. This is looking at it at a different angle, but this idea of online privacy and online safety and the value of their own personal data. We know that our students are often sharing a lot of information about themselves online and perhaps not really recognizing the potential consequences of those actions, both in terms of privacy and in terms of personal safety, perhaps not recognizing how their personal data or information is being used, or not really recognizing why that might be a problem. I've talked to students before about how Google uses their information and how much Google knows about them. And I shared with them a quote from one of the Google founders that's basically like, we know where you are, we know what you're doing, we know what you're thinking, we know more about you than your spouse does. We talk about, do you mind? And most of the students that I've talked to say no. The value of what they get from using Google products to them is worth what they give up. But a lot of them were even unaware of how much they were actually sharing about themselves. Right? And then again, their own role as information creators, or to expand on this, information sharers. That if they, read an article and post it on their social media, and then they're contributing to the spread of misinformation without even realizing that they're doing it. Not recognizing how to protect their own rights if they are, creating music or artwork or photography or writing stories, that they have, rights on how their own information and how their own creative products are being used, and helping them to recognize those issues. So again, I'll pause there and I'll take a look at the chat. And if you can think of any other bottlenecks that you see related to this concept, go ahead and add those into the chat. The chat open here. Okay. Nick asked, do others on here teach students about EndNote or Word doc bibliography tools for citation? Carrie added, yes, the health sciences librarian teaches rough work sessions. We've also developed short videos. Saida add, I suggested to them but do not require. And I can say as a librarian, although it's not part of my role now, previously I did a lot of instruction with students on using citation tools like Zotero and RefWorks. One thing I do always think about, though, if you are teaching students to use those tools, I tend to think of a tool like Zotero or RefWorks as being more appropriate for more advanced students rather than students who just need 1 or 2 citations. But that's a personal preference, and that could be different for different instructors. Haley added, as a graduate student, I have developed some methods of information gathering. I may read a review paper to get a general idea of the topic I'm trying to learn about, and from there find specific primary sources related to keywords. This can potentially be a way to ease underclassmen into research. They can use their Wikipedia pages, but only as a shallow introduction to the real meat of the topic they are covering. That's a great idea, Haley, and I wholeheartedly endorse that idea. We talk a lot about with our students background reading, background knowledge, and using Wikipedia. I personally have never been one to say that we should ban Wikipedia in all cases, but I think it can be used, as you mentioned, as a way to develop more knowledge on a topic. So Stephanie added a citation guide, more information on health sciences librarian uses EndNote. Anna Bazana, I can never pronounce her last name. Let's see. So Brian added, recognizing that everything is important, information, not just scholarly or important sources. Important things, absolutely. I think you were going over some really important information, but I feel like I'm missing how can impact this issue on my courses. So we're going to be talking about assignments and activities in just a second. Let's see, Karen said, I don't embrace Wikipedia, but I will point out the reference section to conclusion as a good place, a starting point. Absolutely. Even though students learn the correct method of citation and using sources, they usually do not apply it outside of my classroom. For other course projects, for example, they will still use the URL or reference. That's a really great idea, Sayeda, and that's something that you notice on a lot of different topics, that they'll learn how to do it in one class, but for some reason not think that it applies to other classes that they are in. So yeah, that's definitely that issue of transfer of knowledge. And that's we could have a whole workshop on that topic alone. Great, so thank you for sharing. Since I don't want to run out of time, I'm going to go ahead and move forward, but we'll try to come back to the chat questions and comments if we have time at the end. Okay, so my next reflection, I just wanted to have you all take just a minute to think about. I was going to do this as a poll, but for time sake, we'll just have you think about it for a second. What types of information sources are most valued in your field and why? So are there specific types of sources that everyone is expected to use? Are there any types of sources that are not acceptable to use? And also think about this question of, is access to information in your field limited in some way? So who has access to information, who doesn't? How will students have access to the information in your field? So I'll give you guys just a few seconds to think about that. Again, you can share any comments that you might have in the chat, and then we'll move on to think about activities and assignments and strategies for getting students to think about these concepts. So Carol added peer-reviewed equals most valued. I think that will be common in a lot of fields, although not always, not every field. Nick added peer-reviewed science articles, lots of time, resources, specialized labor to create and evaluate, absolutely. Carol added access, certainly very disparate in my field of science, depends on socioeconomic and other factors, yes. Brian added hierarchy within peer-reviewed journals as well. That's a great point that I'm sure a lot of students don't really think about, that even a peer-reviewed journal may not be considered as high quality as other journals in that field. Paywalls and journal access, yeah, those are so, such a challenge to make sure that people have access to information with the paywalls. Carrie added access to information reflection. Clinicians in under-resourced locations, hospitals without libraries or journal subscriptions, and does it affect patient care? Absolutely. Okay. So we'll go ahead and in this last section, I'm going to talk briefly about some activities or assignments, where I'm going to talk about multiple activities or assignments, but we don't have time to go in depth into each one of them. But you will have access to assignments that will be available after the workshop in the workshop materials. Right now, there's a few of them that are fully built out, and then within the next day or so, I should have a much larger store of assignments fully built out for everyone to look at. So how do we teach this concept? Those of you that have been to one of the workshops before will recognize now that I always recommend just really starting very small and just having a discussion on this issue of information has value with students. It's probably something that they've never heard this phrase used in this way before. And so having some sort of individual or group discussion or reflection on what it means to think about it, the idea that information has value. What types of value might there be? And who is information valuable to? And why is information valuable to certain groups? So just having people start to think about this issue of information has value. A true-false activity like the one that we did at the beginning of the workshop, just giving students a different group of statements, thinking about different issues related to the value of information and having them consider true-false. And you saw even within our group, there were some that were disagreements amongst some of the statements. Within a group of students, you're likely to get even more disagreement about what's true and what's false. And I've done this kind of activity with a lot of students, and it really does lead to a good discussion and starting to think about this idea of why information has value. A variation of the activity that you could use would be some sort of 2 truths and a lie activity. So give each student or a group of students 3 statements. 2 of those are true, 1 of those are false, and have those pick which one they think is false and explain why they think it's false as compared to the other 2. Again, using video. So I showed a video earlier that you could use. And having them just write a short, quick reflection on how they would describe the concept of information has value after watching the video. I've given them a few additional other videos that I think are helpful to use. The paywall video that's mentioned there, that actually is not a quick activity because that video is about an hour long. That's a really great video that looks at this issue of scholarship and how scholarly journals work, how valuable those companies are, how much money they make, and looks at issues of paywalls and who has access and who doesn't. So it is about an hour-long video, but if you do have time to have your students look at that, it's a great way to really get into this discussion of scholarship and information value. So some sample activities or assignments. This is one that I've done with students a lot, and it always ends up being fun. We kind of play like a Price is Right game, where I would provide students what I would consider a package of information sources. And basically what I mean is I don't actually give them the physical items, but I would give them, here's links to 5 or 6 items. Have them go out and look and find those items and guess together what they think the cost of that package of information is. And you can have, as within the Price is Right, have each group present their answer of what they think the cost is, and the group that gets the closest to the right value is the winning group. But I always use this to lead into this discussion of, why do these things actually end up costing so much? Who gets the money for those things? Who doesn't get money for those things. Textbooks are a great way if you throw those in there and talk about, why do textbooks cost so much? That's always one that really gets students' attention. But I've done this again with multiple classes. It's always a fun little game to just think about how much information, the financial value of information. This can lead into a more specific discussion, or this could be a separate activity where you take one particular book or maybe one particular scholarly journal article or journal that's really relevant to your field and use this to have a discussion related to the value of that source. And this is where you can raise those questions of how much time do you think it was to create this source? What's the financial value of this source to the creator? Are there any other types of value that the creator might get from this source? How much would it cost you to access this source? What is the value of this source to you as a reader? So this gets into the financial value, but also opens up the discussion to other types of values that sources might have for both creators and the consumers. Comparing value. So this is a similar type of activity, but have students think about social media sources versus news versus scholarly journal articles versus books, different types of sources that might be used in the field, having them think about the time and effort involved in the creation of those sources and sort of rank those sources and why, based on the time and effort that involved to create those sources, why certain sources might be more valuable in academic culture than other types of sources. Plagiarism, concerns and fears. So this is something that I've done with students before when we kind of come up into a unit in a class where we're starting to talk about citations and plagiarisms. One of the first things I would do would have them to create some sort of online presentation, or it could be some kind of depiction, a drawing, a video, even like a story, where they share their thoughts on plagiarism and citations. So what are your concerns about plagiarism? What are your fears about plagiarism? And I was astounded the first time I did this assignment, the amount of passion that came through when students did this assignment. You could tell that this is something that they really worry about, that they were really afraid of doing something wrong. But you could also see a lot of real hostility toward this whole issue of plagiarisms and citations. I hate them. I hate it so much. And I was really stunned the first time I saw these responses. Like, I knew students didn't like to do citations, but wow, when I saw their thoughts, and it was really helpful to me to be able to use those and say, you know, everyone has these fears. Everyone has these frustrations surrounding citations. You are not the only one. And so just kind of getting that out there was a good foundation, I think, for moving into a more specific discussion of how to do plagiarisms and citations. Setting that background is, it's okay to be frustrated. It's okay to be annoyed. It's okay to have fears about citations. I have fears about citations in my work. I constantly am forgetting, oh my gosh, did I forget to cite something? So you're not the only one that has those. The value of citations. This is another one that we've done, and this is in a case where we would give students each group like a physical article where we had just blacked out all of the citations, and then have them do an exercise where they have to try to evaluate the relevance of that source, the value of that source, and to answer questions about that source without being able to rely on any of the citations. And then having them use that to reflect on this experience of thinking about, you know, why they need to provide citations, what value do citations have for the information sources that they are using. And this is always a fun activity as well. So citation building. This is another activity where you could have students provide them with note cards, for example, that have the different parts of a citation or different pieces of a citation. So author last name, author first name, date, journal name. And they could be very generic and just be, you know, journal name, date, or they could be specific, you know, a specific journal name, a specific author name, but have it broken up, have the citation broken up into different pieces. And then have the students working together to organize the cards in the correct way to build citations. And you could give them multiple different sources, so types of sources, cards for journal articles, cards for books, cards for websites, and have them combine those pieces of information in order to build a citation together as a group. I think that this kind of activity can help demystify citations a little bit. Thinking it's really just plugging information into the right place. It's almost like a formula, rather than, I think a lot of students are really mystified by the different parts of a citation. So if they can kind of recognize and see that it's just a bunch of different pieces that, you know, you organize in a certain way, I think that that can be a helpful activity. A similar kind of thing, kind of a citation racing game, which I've done a couple of times, where I give students citation information, but it's not in the order of a citation. It's just, just the information that it would take to create those citations, and have them in groups race to put a bunch of citations together in the correct order. I think if you can make it a little more fun, students like to compete against each other, make citations more of a fun process rather than something that they dread doing. This is an example of an activity, this copyright guided review, that we have students do in one of the courses that we teach, Arts and Sciences 2120, where we create a quiz in Carmen Canvas, but each question is immediately followed by an explanation of the correct answer. So a topic like copyright or other topics, plagiarism, these can be very complicated topics. And so we create this quiz, but we give them immediate feedback on every answer that they have. So that as they're going through the quiz, they're getting reinforcement of whether their answer was right or wrong, and getting guidance if they were wrong for why that is. So I think on complicated topics like this, having this sort of step-by-step quiz can be a real help. Another assignment that we've done with students is have them write a personal data reflection. So thinking about themselves and the data that they share about themselves, or the information that they share about themselves online. And thinking about, so, what value does your information have for different entities, different organizations? How much value does a technology have to give you for you to be willing to share your data to have access to that technology? And then, are there any aspects of their life or identity that they don't feel comfortable, having, that other people are having access to that information about them and might be used against them? So again, this is just a way to get students thinking about themselves as information creators, as information sharers, as having personal data that has value to other people, to other organizations, and how that is being used and how willing they are to share that information. And then I think this is the last one. This would probably work best with more advanced students, but this is an activity where you have them research the publication guidelines for a particular journal, and looking in terms of, does that journal charge any publication fees? Does it have an embargo? What does that mean? Who's able to access those journals? Are there any comparable open access journals in the field? And again, I think for more advanced students, this can be, again, a way to get them to start considering themselves as information creators and as having control over how they share their own information creations. Right, so those were some ideas for how you might teach or incorporate this concept. I would love to hear the other ideas that you all might have. I'll go ahead and check the chat. We have about 5 minutes left. So please feel free to go ahead and share, and we'll take a look real quickly at the chat. Let's see. Okay, so yeah, Stephanie posted the link to Paywall, the movie, in there, as well as the Information Has Value video. Carrie, love this idea, the price is right. Haley, I would suggest that professors and instructors discuss when cited information can eventually become common knowledge and no longer need citations. This info will vary from field to field, so perhaps in the first core class for each major, this can be taught. That's a great idea, Haley. The idea of common knowledge is one that I know that sometimes confuses students. And so thinking about common knowledge, especially in the context of a particular field, I think could be very helpful. Nick asked, anyone try plagiarism case study discussions? Have them discuss what is or isn't plagiarism. I think that's a great idea, Nick, having them compare a couple of different examples and talk about why one might be considered plagiarism and one might not. Haley, yes, not solely plagiarism, but also with copyright and intellectual property. I believe there are guidelines available. There are definitely guidebooks available to those issues. Megan added, Haley, I give students a sample paragraph on our topic without citations and have them discuss what requires a citation and what can be considered common knowledge. That's a great activity. Love that. And then Lori added, like the two truths and a lie activity and the price is right. Wonderful. So got a couple more minutes. If you have any additional ideas or activities, you can go ahead and paste put those into the chat. Carol added, I love the idea of asking students how much time they think it took the authors to create and publish a given source. In terms of how I plan to teach information as value, I have a fall course on science literacy, and virtually all that you have shared in these workshops is useful for me, provides further and new food for thought and great sources. Plan on revamping my course. Some revamping, I'm grateful, thanks. Thank you, Carol, that is wonderful to hear. I'm glad that this has been helpful to you. All right, so if you do have any questions or any comments that you would like to share later on, please go ahead and send me an email. Again, it's hammonds.73@osu.edu. There is also the link there to all of the workshop materials, so you'll be able to access the PowerPoint. Once the video is ready to go, you'll be able to access the video. There is the action plan document in there, and then there are sample assignments and activities. And again, right now there are only a few in there, although that will definitely be built out much more in the next couple of days. And then the last thing I wanted to share with everyone, and I forgot to change the date on this, but our next workshop is next Thursday, so it's June 18th. And that topic is authority is constructed and contextual. So I think Stephanie does have the correct link for that one, so she'll share that one. But June 18th at noon, the topic will be authority is constructed and contextual. And if you do want to have a deeper dive into information literacy, you might want to consider enrolling in the Teaching Information Literacy Endorsement. So this is a fully online course that goes much more into detail about information literacy, about the different concepts, and then about course and assignment design. So it takes you through the process of identifying information literacy learning outcomes, developing assessments, assignments, and activities around information literacy in your courses. If you do complete that course, you can earn the endorsement, the Teaching Information Literacy endorsement from the Drake Institute. So Stephanie has shared all the contact information as well as the information for the next workshop. We are right at 12:59. So if you have any final questions or comments, please go ahead and share those. I'll hang around for a couple of minutes, but other than that, I think we are done for today. So I want to thank you all again. Thank you, Stephanie, for all your help and sharing everything with everyone. And I hope to see you all again at our next workshop on June 18th on Authority is Constructed and Contextual. So thank you all. Oh, thanks from Hawaii. I bet a lot of us wish we were in Hawaii right now. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but I will hang around for another couple minutes in case there's any final questions or problems.